Hi and welcome. My name is Ryan O'Connell and I'll be your instructor during this training session. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for subscribing to my YouTube channel. I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to watch this video and passing the word on. In this video, we are going to create our very first Linux machine. We're going to do a 1,000-foot view of what is a virtual machine. We are going to create that virtual machine using Cloud Shell. We're going to connect using SSH. We're going to install Apache web server. We're going to test that connection, and of course we are going to clean up our resources. So what is an Azure virtual machine in a nutshell? An Azure virtual machine, or a Linux virtual machine, is a machine running a distribution of Linux as the guest operating system. And Linux OSs are Ubuntu, CentOS, Debian, SUSE, Red Hat, and I can go on. There are many more versions or distributions of Linux or distros. When you create a virtual machine, especially a Linux machine, by default it's going to create two drives. It'll create a drive for the operating system, and it'll create a temporary drive for temporary storage that Linux uses to mount the Linux agent, and it's also used for the swap file. To create a Linux virtual machine, we have a number of methods. We can use the portal, we can use Cloud Shell, we can use PowerShell, and we can use the resource manager template. Selecting an image is one of the first and most important decisions you'll make when creating a VM. An image is a template that is used to create a VM. These templates include operating systems, often other software as well, such as development tools or web hosting environments. Just bear in mind the Azure Virtual Disk size are measured in gigabits, not gigabytes, and they're not the same. And as you can see here, 1 gigabit is approximately 1074 gigabytes. So you multiply that by the size of the virtual machine you want, and then you can get the exact size of gigabytes that your VM would use, for example. Again, what are command shells? Command shells are environments that allow you to manage the operating system, such as Windows or Linux, where you execute commands using text. The Azure CLI perspective, there are two primary command shells. They are Bash and PowerShell. Bash was originally designed for Unix and treats output as text, where PowerShell is designed specially for Windows and treats the output as objects. So you can learn more about this, both with Bash and PowerShell, as you move through and do a bit of study on your own. The Cloud Shell, or the command line interface, is Microsoft's platform experience for managing Azure resources. It's built specially for managing Azure via the command line. Some of the key features include interactive mode, multiple output formats. You can combine multiple commands into a single command. It's flexible with extensions, and it's cross-platform, which means it works on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. So this is one of the great advantages of using Cloud Shell. Again, Cloud Shell versus PowerShell versus the portal. The Azure CLI is designed to be cross-platform and can be used to manage, like I say, Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, and it's built specifically for Azure so that you can manage all your resources via the command line. PowerShell is designed for scripting and configuration and management environments for various Microsoft systems and relies on modules in order to support Azure. The Azure portal is a graphical interface where we log in using a web browser, and we can manage our resources that way as well. SDKs, or software development kits, are a collection of libraries that are built to make Azure services from your language of choice easy to use, and these libraries are designed to be constant. Again, if you're a developer, you'll know more about SDKs. This course doesn't cover SDKs. It's just giving you that 1,000-foot overview of what the difference is between Cloud Shell, PowerShell, and the portal. Again, when we create an Azure VM from the CLI, as you can see, we would paste some of these commands in. So this is the first step. We'll paste in or type these commands in to create our virtual machine, and as you can see, it will put it in a resource group. It'll name the virtual machine, it'll select the image, you obviously add in your username and generate the SSH keys, which is what you use to connect to that Linux virtual machine. As you can see, once that command is run, you'll get an output. And it's really important that you take note of your public IP address, because you use your public IP address to connect to your Linux virtual machine. Again, we want to open up port 80 on our virtual machine. The reason we need to open up port 80 is because if port 80 is not open, we can't connect to our Nginx web server. So we do need to open up that port so that when we do connect, Nginx server allows that incoming connection. Connecting to the virtual machine, once you've created your virtual machine, you would then use your username and then obviously your public IP address. You'd press enter, and then that would allow you to connect to your Linux virtual machine. That's why I said to you earlier on, it is important that you take note of your public IP address. Again, once we've connected to our Linux machine, we want to do a sudo update, obviously to update the Linux operating system. And then of course we want to go and install Nginx web server application. So once we've done that, we can then go ahead and connect to our web server just by typing that public IP address into a web browser, whether that be Firefox, Edge, or Chrome, and that should then pop up our Nginx welcome web server page. And of course, at the end of the day, you always want to clean up your resources. The reason you want to do that is because if you're not using virtual machines, you want to turn them off so they're in a deallocated mode, or completely delete them. And this is the command to delete the resource group, and that will delete everything related to that VM. So let's log on to Azure and actually go and do a live hands-on demo. Hi, as you can see, I've logged into the portal and I've navigated to resource groups. So the first thing we want to do before we create any virtual machine or any resources is to create a resource group to put our resources in that group. It'll be easier for us to clean up and manage as we go through our Azure infrastructure at the end of the day. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create. I'm going to go ahead and paste in a name that I have called Linux Test RG for my resource group. Click Review and Create, and click Create. Now this is going to go away and create that resource group. We need that resource group because that is where we are going to put our Linux machine in. I'm going to go ahead in the notifications icon here and dismiss these notifications, and I'm going to now move over to Cloud Shell. In Cloud Shell, we're going to go ahead and create our Linux machine. We can switch between Cloud and Bash, and this is an example of cross-platform, so this is brilliant. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in some commands that I already have typed out in Notepad, and I'll explain these to you before I run these commands. So what this command is going to do, it's going to create the virtual machine. It's going to put the virtual machine in the resource group we've just created called Linux Test RG. We are going to name that Linux virtual machine Linux VM. We are going to use the Ubuntu version of Linux. The username is azuser, and of course we are going to generate some SSH keys so that we can connect to our virtual machine securely. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter, and this is going to go away and create our virtual machine or deploy our virtual machine. And this can take anywhere from a minute to 5 minutes, just depending on the type of virtual machine you are deploying. So we'll wait for a few seconds while this virtual machine deploys. And as you can see, that didn't take long. Our virtual machine has deployed successfully. So what we want to do is we want to copy our public IP address, and you will see why in a moment. So I'm going to click copy, and I'm going to go ahead and just paste that into Notepad so that I've got that. The next thing we want to do on our virtual machine is we actually want to open up port 80. The reason we want to open up port 80 is because we want to install Nginx web server, and we need port 80 open so that we can access that web server. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this command in, but I'm going to explain this command to you. azvm open port is going to open up the port. We want port 80 open. We want it open for the resource group Linux Test RG, and we want it open for the Linux VM machine. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter, and this is going to go ahead and open up that port, and it won't take long. It takes a couple of seconds for that port to open, and once that port's open, we can go ahead and connect to our virtual machine. And as you can see, that port is open. So now we are going to take our public IP address that we had, and we are going to then use that public IP address to connect to our virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to that virtual machine. So I'm just going to paste this command in, and of course you want to use SSH, AZ user, and our public IP address. That's why I said we need to copy our public IP address, because we will need it to connect to our Linux VM. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter, and this is giving me a confirmation. Are you sure you want to connect? So I say yes, I want to connect, and I'm going to press enter, and this is going to connect me to my Linux virtual machine. And as you can see, I am connected because it says AZ user, and there's the Linux VM name, and of course we can see the $sign. So this is telling us that we have connected to our Linux virtual machine. So the first thing we want to do is, once you connect to a Linux virtual machine, is we want to go ahead and update that Linux machine with the latest updates. So I'm going to go ahead and just paste a command in here, and this command is sudo update. So I'm just going to paste that in. You can type this in if you want. So we are going to say sudo get update and update this virtual machine. I'm going to go ahead and press enter, and this is going to go out and it's going to update our virtual machine. Once we've updated our virtual machine, we can go ahead and install Nginx web server using the same command but with the install parameters. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that command in, and of course it's sudo apt get. The reason we put -y is so that we can confirm everything, so we don't get prompted for any thing to do. So we're going to install Nginx, so I'm going to go ahead and press enter. And this is going to go away and install Nginx web server for us. And it won't take too long to install. It installs it pretty quick. And then once Nginx server is installed, we will then open up a web browser and try and connect to our web server to see if it actually works. So we'll just wait for a few seconds while this installs, and there we go, it's installed. It's that quick. So what you want to do is open up a web browser. So I'm going to open up a web browser at the top here, and I'm going to paste in that IP address, and I'm going to press enter, and there we go. We have successfully connected to our Nginx web server on our Linux VM. So that was pretty easy. So I'm going to go ahead and close this down, and of course if we want to exit out of this virtual machine, you can just close it here, or you can do it nice and smoothly by just typing exit and press enter, and this will exit us out of that connection nice and smoothly. So I'm going to go ahead and close this down, and I'm going to navigate over to our resource groups, and I'm going to click on the Linux resource group. And as you can see in the Linux resource group, there's our virtual machine with all of our resources that it creates. By default, it's going to create a virtual network, it's going to create a net card, it's going to give us a public IP address, it's going to create a network security group, as well as the disk, and of course the virtual machine. If we move over to virtual machines, you will see our Linux VM is over here. And if you noticed, when we typed exit in bash, all we did was exit our virtual machine. We didn't stop our virtual machine. So we go ahead and click stop and say okay, and this is going to go ahead and stop that virtual machine. What we want to do now is clean up our resources. And the reason we want to clean up our resources, we don't want to pay for things that we don't want to use. So it's good practice when you're training is to create your labs, create your virtual machines, create your resource groups, and then delete them afterwards. But doing it the correct way is really important. So we're going to just wait a little bit while this goes ahead and cleans up our resources in terms of stopping that virtual machine. Once that virtual machine has stopped, we can then go ahead and delete that virtual machine. So we'll just wait a few seconds while that virtual machine stops. And there we go, that virtual machine has stopped, and as you can see here, we've got a notification that it stopped successfully. So I'm going to dismiss that, and then I'm going to go ahead and delete that virtual machine, and I'm going to click OK. And that machine is going to be deleted. Also, if you want to use a virtual machine, if you stop it and make sure that it's in a deallocated mode, you're still not paying for it. So you can always fire it up later at the end of the day and use it again. And as you can see, our virtual machine has been deleted successfully, and we have no virtual machine here. We can click the refresh button to confirm that it has been deleted. But again, we want to clean up our resource group. If I go to our resource groups and I go to my Linux resource group, you'll notice we still have some resources lingering here. So we can go ahead and delete our resource group. So I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to say copy. I'm going to delete that resource group, and I'm going to paste that name in, because we need to paste the name in or type the name in of the resource group we want to delete. Then I'm going to go ahead and press the delete button, and this is going to go ahead and delete that resource group. And again, it won't take long to delete that, so we'll just wait for a few seconds while that resource group deletes. And as you can see, it didn't take too long, and that resource group has been deleted. I'm going to dismiss all the notifications, and then I'm going to go ahead and move over and click the refresh button. This is going to refresh everything so we can see all of our resources have gone. I'm going to close that down and hit the refresh a couple of times here on the console just to make sure. So what we've done in this little exercise is we've created a virtual machine. We've installed Nginx Web Server. We've installed SSH keys. We've connected to that Linux virtual machine. We've actually connected to that Nginx web browser using our public IP address. And we've gone ahead and cleaned up our resources after us so that we have a nice fresh console again for the next lab. I'd like to thank you for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos. I also want to say thank you very much for taking the time to find this video on my channel. I want to thank you again for subscribing to my channel, and I look forward again to seeing you in future videos.